Hi, I'm David DeSteno, and I am thrilled to be here with Sharon Salzberg, who is one of the nation's most beloved teachers of mindfulness. Sharon, thank you for taking the opportunity to join us as part of this series of discussions at PopTech.
Thank you so much.
So one of the main themes we're discussing in this series of conversations is how religions offer people psychological tools that they can use to help their well-being, and how religions have offered these tools to help us deal with the challenges life throws at us. When you and I have talked about this in the past, you told me one of the things that initially attracted you to Buddhism is its potential to offer tools that could help you at a certain stage of life. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us your path to mindfulness and how and why you found it to be so helpful, and how and why it's changed you.
Yeah, well, I first encountered Buddhism in a real way when I went to college. And I was 17 years old. I was a sophomore in college, and I took an Asian philosophy course. And there were two things about the course that were riveting for me. One was the Buddha's very unafraid, unashamed acknowledgement of the suffering in life. Like many people, I'd had a very traumatic childhood, a lot of upheaval, a lot of loss. And like for many people, mine was a family system where this was just never ever spoken about. And so I didn't know what to do with all of those feelings within me. And I always felt weird, different, an outsider to the norm. And here was the Buddha, in effect, saying, you belong. You have a place in life, because this is a part of everyone's life. And it was literally breathtaking for me. It was like the first time in my life I felt myself moving away from a sense of marginalization into the center of life. And I also heard in that course that there were tools. Tools is my favorite word, actually. Tools that were methods that you could actually use. They were direct, they were practical. And if you use them, you could be a whole lot happier. So if I was going to describe myself at the age of 17 in one word, I would probably say fragmented. And yet somewhere with all of that going on, I had a wild intuition. I thought, maybe it would help me. So I created an independent study project for the university. I said, I want to go to India for a year and study meditation. And they said, okay. So I left in the fall of 1970 and actually found exactly what I was looking for, which was a kind of distilled dissemination of the tools in January of 1971. And that's where I began meditating.
You weren't buying into the theology at that point. It was the tools. And so as you started to do that, how did it begin to change your view of the world?
Well, my first teacher was S.N. Goenka, and he taught in the form of an intensive, immersive 10-day retreat. So that's how I began. I walked into that compound. I'd never meditated for a moment before in my life. And there I was. And the first night of that retreat, he said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the foundational statement of my entire path. And I've always believed it. Sometimes I hear the term secular mindfulness and I think, well, it's how it was always presented to me. There's a context, there's a philosophy, there are ethics, there's all kinds of things, but it was always presented in the form of, this is an exploration. This is something for you to discover. You don't have to believe anything. This whole process is a process of kind of fine-tuning your own awareness so you can see for yourself.
What do you see for this tool of meditation? What was its original purpose? And can you give us some examples of how it actually accomplishes that as a tool?
And in terms of the classical approach to meditation, certainly within the Buddhist context, the main purpose of meditation or mindfulness is insight or wisdom. It's not just inhabiting your life, it's understanding your life. It's really having a very personal, direct view of, say, what actually causes suffering? What makes me happy? We may have been brought up, and I think I was brought up with a kind of ethos of, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and you shouldn't help anybody else because they're not going to help you. And don't show too much feeling because you'll be too vulnerable. And I mean, we absorb quite a lot, right? From families, from culture and so on. And we get to see like, wow, is this sort of, being hell-bent on vengefulness really all that good? Like, what does it feel like? and how much loneliness is in that desire, and how much fear is in that anger. And um, even within fear, like I've spent a good amount of time looking at my own fear. And something I've seen, for example, is that unlike the world's pronouncement that we're afraid of the unknown, I'm actually afraid when I think I do know, and it's going to be really bad. And it's all the stories that I tell myself that really get me going. And even in the midst of that, if I remind myself, you know what, you don't know, I feel space. And once I feel space, I feel options.
Yeah.
There's some sense of possibility. So those are just very personal insights. And then they're more universal insights about, look at how everything is changing. I took this emotion to be who I truly am, as though I never feel anything else, or this painful feeling physically or emotionally as solid, unremitting, pervasive. But look at it, it's moving, it's changing. And we see, strangely enough, because I always think this is so odd, because meditation can seem like the most solitary activity in the universe. You may be all alone, your eyes may be closed, but we come to a profound knowing of how connected all of our lives are. That in truth, everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants that sense of belonging that I wanted so badly.
Oftentimes people will say, well, I go to therapy for that, right? And help me see what my mind is doing, why I'm feeling depressed, why I'm feeling anxious. And sure, and I think that works, but I think one of the true benefits of meditation, this is speaking for someone who's not nearly as expert at it as you are, but from thinking about it, is that it allows me to, in deconstructing some of those processes of my mind, to being an observer rather than absorbed in it, I can see the processes. And when you can actually see what your mind's doing, rather than having therapists tell you this is what your mind's doing, you feel more empowered to understand it and to change it. Some of the most important biases in psychology, the way we convince people that they're real is to show them, oh, they're making that wrong decision bias in the moment, and they can see themselves make it. And I think in some part, meditation, by deconstructing those automatic lenses that we look through, it can be more powerful and more eye-opening.
I think it's the immediacy of it that makes it the most practical tool we can imagine. I've had people say, I was teaching a group of people who survived gun violence in Parkland, in the school shooting, and one was a teacher, and she had to leave the retreat and go back to work the next day, and they had a drill. And she had a panic attack, doubled over in a closet, and she reminded herself, you know what, I have tools. And so in that moment, she wasn't trying to talk herself out of her experience. She was trying to achieve a certain kind of balance.
What you're saying there actually brings me to another point I wanted to bring up, the work with the Parkland shooting. I know you wrote an op-ed piece for The Hill, where you described doing a Metaminute, and you can tell us what that means in a minute, for people who were concerned with the separation of families and children that is going on at the border. And some of the people said, well, you got criticized for this, but why don't you go do something about it rather than just sit there on your cushion? But I'm wondering if you can just speak to that issue. And I know, your new book is out, Real Change, is how do we make change in the world? So if we want to not only feel better, but we want to be a positive influence, what's the role of mindfulness in that?
I think that is probably the most common criticism. And I think the language we use in some ways is responsible for that. When we talk about mindfulness, a true but often misconstrued definition would be something like accepting things the way that they are, or being with your experience without judgment. And that does imply a kind of passivity or inertness to us. The idea is really not to be passive or to be inert, but to be discerning, to not be driven by habits of mind, to have options. And I think it actually fuels action. It doesn't take away. So metta, M-E-T-T-A, the word you're referring to, means loving kindness. And I was asked by somebody, it was actually at an airport somewhere, if I would lead a minute of loving kindness meditation for the kids who are in cages. And I did get a whole variety of different pieces of feedback. Some people were so grateful, because part of what happens is that we can feel very alone. And to have some sense of collective action where people have the same values is very important. And I did get the comments like, you're as bad as the people who just send thoughts and prayers. You're not doing anything. And I am a big fan, by the way, of voting. I think that's an excellent thing to do amongst many actions. And, you know, I had already donated and things like that. And when I said in response is what I think the gift of meditation or mindfulness can be. First of all, these things are hard to look at, even from a distance. It's very hard to bear witness. And there's nothing easier than looking the other way or falling into denial. And what helps me be there in a more sustained way is connecting to something bigger. The force of love, which I really value. The fact that together we can reinforce that value.
Let me just ask you to hold on for 1 second, because in psychology we study this a lot, and it's we call it compassion fade or compassion fatigue. And it's often when you feel overwhelmed by mass suffering or when you feel helpless, you turn away. Mm-hmm. And you do that because you can't sit with that pain. It is too difficult. And we oftentimes talk about the difference between empathy and compassion. Yeah. Empathy is where we feel the pain. If you're always feeling someone else's pain, it can burn you out. But if you feel compassion, it makes you want to act. And so, you know, we have evidence where people meditate for 8 weeks, suddenly they are more likely to want to go out and they'll jump to help others in pain. They're more resistant to compassion fatigue. And so part of that is being open to that, something I know you've called equanimity. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we also try to make the distinction between empathy and compassion being one possible response to that moment of empathy, which may be a necessary building block, necessary but not sufficient condition for compassion to arise. So compassion in the Buddhist psychology would be defined as the trembling or the quivering of the heart in response to seeing pain or suffering. So that's the empathy part. And it's a movement toward to see if you can be of help. So that also implies maybe a balance of compassion for yourself and for others. And it's a movement toward, not into, to burn up yourself, to see if you could be of help, not with that kind of overweening, you know, savior complex, like I'm going to fix it all. So I see it as really sequential. Like maybe you have that moment of empathy and it frightens you and you just want to turn away, or you have that moment of empathy and you're so depleted, you're so tired anyway, you just can't bear to hang in there. And so we talk about compassion having more balance within it than any of those states. It's that movement toward to see if we can be of help. And the secret ingredient is what we call equanimity, which does mean balance. And it's the balance that is the voice of wisdom. It's perspective. Like, yes, you know, I will do everything I can, and it's not all in my hands.
Well, it's funny, in our work, we find not only that after we have people meditate for several weeks, we put them in situations where we use actors to frame these situations. They believe other people are in distress, and they just suddenly become more automatically compassionate, proving that it works. Not that you need me to tell you that. But we also have other work where we show that having suffered in life in the past and come through that also leads to compassion, which speaks to me that, you know, the idea of people have gone through adversity in their life and come through it. It doesn't, sure, for some people it can harden your heart, but for most people, it warms it. It lets you know that there were acts that people did to you that were helpful. Now you can tolerate that sense of difficulty and you want to pay them back. And so our goal here, of course, isn't to say, well, we should make more people suffer so that they can be more compassionate. But I think what meditation does is it allows them to face and sit with the suffering of others, to not turn away, and to have that wisdom of what to do about it. And to me, it's just the perfect psychological tool to help people accept that and then to go out and act on it, not to turn away. Last question I'm going to cover with you is, is there any danger in doing some of these practices without the scaffolding that religious traditions normally put around them? And what I mean by that is, mindfulness becomes very trendy and there's lots of apps, and some apps are good. I know you have an app. We work with an app in our lab. There's also, though, these reports of people sometimes having poor outcomes, kind of like a dark night of the soul. It can be very disconcerting. And I'm wondering, what's your view of is it okay to completely remove these practices from the guidance and wisdom of teachers? Is there any possible danger in that? How should we think about using these tools?
Well, I applaud the tools. I mean, I think access is an incredibly important thing. But in terms of like the dark night of the soul, there are many people who uncover material that's very uncomfortable. And the belief is like, I've got to break through this. And if you have a teacher, they may well say to you, I don't want you sitting for more than 5 minutes. You know, I don't want you sitting with your eyes closed. How about taking a walk or go help somebody? Wouldn't that be great? You know, like you're feeling the greatest distress, you feel worthless, whatever it might be. You know what affects that more than anything? Helping one person in some small way.
And you know, we had research in the past 10 years show that helping someone actually the brain interprets as rewarding. But here again, right, this is something that people knew for millennia before we research psychologists found it. And so I just love this as an example of how we as scientists should be working with folks who are religious thinkers and vice versa to try and find out how these practices work and where we can test and see and make things accessible in the best way. So with that, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's always good to see you.
Yeah, take care.